Project Lawful aka Planecrash by Arwayne aka Eliezer Yudkowsky and Lintamande. To Hell with Science. Episode 129.
Okay, what else is part of science? Replication and reproducibility, right? You'd think that would be obvious and emergent from the rest of the setup. But it got taught to me as a distinct principle, so somebody thought it needed separate focus and emphasis. If in civilization you report that some procedure works for refining 10 pounds of spell silver ore into 20 pounds of spell silver, the prediction markets, on the result of a general or generic experiment like that one, don't all immediately go to 100 and pay out. In this case, even if you took video recordings of your experiment so people knew you weren't just lying, that you had at least put in a lot of effort to fake the video, market traders would still be pretty skeptical. The relevant prediction market would be on what would happen if known, competent, careful, previously validated, third-party professional replicators tried the same experiment. And I doubt that prediction market would go very far above 0%, if the claim was that you could refine 10 pounds of ore into 20 pounds of spell silver, assuming spell silver was otherwise known to be mostly pure metal and not have components that could be drawn from the air or other refining materials. Now, if you're the original discoverer, you probably find that pretty annoying, right? You published your experimental results, and those stinky prediction markets still don't believe you. So after double-checking your own work, at least you double-check it first if you're at all sane or smart. Well, mostly, you discover that enormous blatant error you made, where the scales you were using to measure the ore weight were broken. But let's say that doesn't happen. Then you buy up all those prediction market shares that are trading at under 1% that your experiment replicates. The market price starts to go up, obviously. But as it starts to get above 2%, more traders start to come in, checking to see if they think they can make a quick 2% profit off you. Your prediction sounds completely nuts. They figure this is just a prank or somebody making a weird point, so they start to sell at 2%. You buy more. Some of the less confident counter-traders drop out when they see you're willing to spend that much. Sometimes the way the story goes from here is that the probability gets as high as 20%. If the proposition at stake is an important one, 20% is high enough that an outside venture philanthropist will come in and fund a replication of the research done by professional replicators, because the impact of replicating the original maniacal experiment, if the results reproduce, will sell for more than 5 times the cost of doing the replication. Let's say that doesn't happen, because the idea you can refine 10 pounds of ore to 20 pounds of spell silver is such a ridiculous one that your counterparties are still confident. They keep buying the prediction's price down, even as you keep trying to buy it up. It never gets above 4%. Once you've spent a large portion of your savings on amassing a huge position like that, you spend a pretty large chunk of whatever's left on the actually quite expensive project of paying respected replicators with the certs to actually resolve the prediction market, to test your method, which they will do very, very carefully, taking videos of everything, that you inspect to say beforehand rather than afterwards if you think they're doing anything wrong along the way. Usually the way the story ends is that somebody loses a chunk of their savings and gains a valuable life lesson about overconfidence. Sometimes, very rarely, it ends with a lot of shocked prediction market traders who lost a much bigger collective chunk of their own wealth, and a story that makes all the newspapers. Your name becomes one of the glorious science. Heroic stories that inspires the next generation to not just believe what everybody else believes. World-class professional sex workers will compete to seduce you, just to be able to advertise to their other clients that they won that competition. Also, you can sell your prediction market shares at a 25-fold profit. But that's not why you did it, really. The money is just how other people can know that it was all real, because real money changed hands.
Where does the typical researcher get the funds to pay for all these prediction market shares and replications? It's not like researchers are wizard with spells to sell, right? Doth Elon doesn't have wizards.
Well, if you are 10 years old and your parents aren't very wealthy and indulgent, and your theory isn't so persuasive that you could convince other venture scientists to go in with you on it, then you are not in fact going to pull this off. That's considered a feature of civilization, not a bug. It prevents civilization from being snowed under with futile replication attempts for silly ideas. You can be poor and persuasive and still get an expensive experiment performed, or rich and unpersuasive, but you've got to be at least one of rich and persuasive. That said, let's say that the prestigious replicators earn 4 times what you do per workday, and it'll take 5 of them working for 10 days to replicate your experiment, plus some relatively lower cost to rent equipment. Then their cost is on the order of 200 days of your salary. If you save 1/3 of what you earn for 5 years, you can pay for 1 experiment like that and still have 2/3 of your savings left over. Also, to be clear, if an experimental report is being put forward by anyone who's not a 10-year-old, there will always be some prediction market about whether a replication would reproduce those results. You're expected to state your initial price and subsidize that market at least a little, which is how you say to the world that you actually believe your own results at all. But civilization knowing more stuff is to some irreducible degree a non-rival, non-excludable public good, so the philanthropists come in and subsidize a process where some experiments will be randomly selected for replication. That is, the selection is random from a probability distribution that goes according to complicated formulas that include the market odds, the market volume, and any advance obvious impact. The point being, almost any experiment has some probability of being actually replicated, in which case the conditional prediction market on the outcome of the replication will pay out. That incentivizes accurate prediction markets and careful trading, even on relatively minor experiments that wouldn't usually pay to get replicated by one of the big, expensive, high-trust professional replication firms. Or as my teachers emphasized to me a lot, if an experiment didn't have any prediction market price on reproducing, how would you have any idea what civilization thought of it? Would there really be a sense in which civilization collectively knew anything about the result? There being a prediction market, with some chance of the replication actually being performed in order to incentivize careful trading, is a key condition for an experiment really being part of science at all. Without that, maybe somebody knows something about that result, but civilization doesn't know anything about it. Probably the people who actually think about science in tremendous detail are betting that if we stop making prediction markets for everything, science will start to fall apart. So that part gets emphasized to children to prevent that scenario. I don't know the details, unfortunately. I'm just guessing based on how much different stuff got emphasized to me.
Are there other known science failure modes? Ways all of civilization stays wrong about something?
So another precaution they emphasized was pre-registration. You describe the experiment before you perform it and open a prediction market on the results before they're in. That forces civilization to make its own prediction in advance. It lets anybody object beforehand instead of afterwards if they have an issue with your experimental procedure. It makes them look less persuasive if they wait until you get a result they don't like, to claim something was wrong with your methodology. On a civilizational level, we were told that pre-registration guards against a scenario where people think that boring or expected results are failures and don't bother to report on those, until somebody by random luck gets a misleading, exciting result and reports on that. There's a whole dramatic debate about whether or not, in principle, we ought to pay any attention to results that aren't pre-registered, if somebody reports on them anyways. Because of how, if you say we should throw the results like that away, it means we're virtuously refusing to update on what is in fact evidence. Conversely, if we pay attention to results like that, we're creating bad systemic incentives. Obviously, that scenario basically never comes up in real life. To the extent it ever did come up in real life, I figure people would just toss the original result and pay a replicator to do it over again, if it was anything important. But, I'm realizing as I say it, that none of this stuff is what we need to think about on a mini-science. Project the size of Project Lawful. We're small enough that we can just know about all the experiments everyone is doing and say all our individual probabilities on them out loud in advance. We don't have professional replicators to appeal to. All we can do basically is run any important experiments twice with a different researcher in charge. I'm sort of flailing here, going through things in random order, as you can probably tell. In Dathilan, we all sort of grow up knowing how science is supposed to work, if only vaguely to start with, so at no point does anybody try to teach you the whole thing all at once. There's just little pieces here and there where you learn in more detail how some bit of science works. What else is there to doing science? I suppose there's integrating the results from multiple experiments, reporting them in a unified way, so that multiple lines of evidence can be collected. Somebody mentioned that part already? That part is sort of obvious if you know any law of probability. There's only one obviously correct way to do that. Well, no, there was that one kid in class who invented his own wacky way of doing it, so it's not that obvious. Probably I need to get out of the mindset of believing that saying obvious things will bore everyone here. Galarian isn't doing it yet, so it's not that obvious. Though collecting results across multiple experiments is also something you'd do just as an individual investigating something on your own, meaning it's not really science. As such, but whatever, it'll be actually useful to the project. I'm just going to talk about accumulating data across different people's experiments, whether or not you call that by the term science. Or no, let's go ahead and maniacally experiment to determine whether it actually is obvious, or I just grew up that way. Asmodia, how would you collect together the results from 3 experiments meant to distinguish among 3 hypotheses?
Keltham, you literally ran that exact problem on me earlier, when you were trolling me, remember? Luckily for your real question, I'd worked it out on my own before then, while wearing the artifact headband, and I can confirm that it's obvious. But yeah, say you've got 3 hypotheses, like ordinary Asmodia, conspiracy Asmodia, and time-traveling Asmodia. They all start out with some probability weights attached to them. Keltham didn't actually say what his prior weights were, but let's say they were 0.9, 0 ordinary, 0.06, conspiracy, 0.03, time travel, and 0.01 for something else. But we're not going to consider that part.
Asmodia, I was supposed to be dead forever and found myself in another dimension with alternate physics. That is both economic magic and conceptual magic. Like the story isn't even trying to be respectable about considering their consequences separately, was immediately allocated a research harem containing masochists. Then the god of mind-altering substances cursed one of my researchers to give out cookies, and governance forgot to tell me about that for 2 days. I am well above 1% on the none of the above hypothesis. People in Dath Ilan are above 1% on the what if everything about reality is actually completely different from how it looks. Hypothesis, it's just that usually there's not much practical you can do about that.
80%? Ordinary Asmodia, 10% conspiracy Asmodia, 3% time-traveling Asmodia. Actually, I'm just going to run with that. Speaking as either ordinary Asmodia or somebody pretending to be her in great detail, ordinary Asmodia doesn't want to help conspiracy Asmodia by asking Keltham to reveal what his probabilities on conspiracy were at the time.
Now you're getting it, or realistically pretending to have just now gotten it.
Security tells some of these idiots to look incredulous, or ask, what, or something. Alter Cheliax did not have me using this exact case as an important lesson in probability law and also conspiracy maintenance, and also Keltham. Their alter personas should be confused about now.
What?
That was probably a little high context, wasn't it?
Really? Do you think?
All right, different example. Suppose there's a murder case with 3 possible suspects.
Asmodia, you can't just not explain now and leave them wondering. That would be mean.
Keltham is tracking on an ongoing basis the possibility that his new world of Galarian is constructing an elaborate lie around him, including, for example, there not really being any such country as Cheliax. Do not worry about this, or try to do anything proactive about it. Keltham is a Dath Ilani, and will not automatically conclude that everything is a giant lie, even if he is looking for possible evidence of that. We just need to be ourselves, and have faith in his ability to discern reality as reality. Keltham was also, I think briefly, but I haven't actually asked, tracking the possibility that my overnight personality change and sudden mastery of the law of probability was due to my mind traveling a few months backward in time, rather than Manohar dropping an artifact headband on me for 2 hours. Keltham then observed me do 2 things and failed to do a third. I forget what his exact probabilities were at this point. She'll probably still remember them with awful clarity 100 years later. But the point is, he guessed? Calculated? I don't understand this part very well. Some probabilities for how likely I was to do thing #1 if I was ordinary or conspiracy or time traveler. Then probabilities for my doing thing #2, and then probabilities for my doing #3. Except I didn't do thing #3, so negate those probabilities. I mean, subtract them from 1.
Specifically, I just offered Asmodia a lower salary than all of my other researchers. She'd just written something down on a piece of paper, and what I was predicting was, 1, the chance that what she'd written was a prediction about me trolling her. 2, if she'd made that prediction, the chance that she'd assign a probability to her statement. 3, if the first 2 things happened, the chance that she would write down that I would predict her prediction.
Asmodia goes up to the board and writes the example. Ordinary conspiracy time traveler. Prior, 0.80.1.0.03. Writes, y.50.2, 0.80 quantifies, y.6, 0.7, 0.9, 0 prediction, n, 1.401.2, 01.90. And then... Keltham didn't actually say this part, because it was obvious given what we already learned. He multiplied his starting probabilities by all the likelihoods for each of the events and ended up with, give me a second, product, 0.14, 0.0, 11.002. Not that it was actually that, because those weren't actually his probabilities, but that's the obvious way to combine multiple pieces of evidence. Though I'm leaving out the part where what really changes is the ratio between the chances, not really the chances themselves. At the end, it's like 13 times as much ordinary as conspiracy, and 5 times as much conspiracy as time traveler, where previously it was 8 times as much ordinary as conspiracy, and 3 times as much conspiracy as time traveler. If we didn't already have the law and were looking for law fragments, I'd observe that it doesn't matter what order you consider the data in, because it doesn't matter what order you multiply numbers. Or that you could take the first results and multiply by those and call the result your new prior, and then multiply by the second and third results to get the new posterior. And that'd also be the same. Those seem like the kind of coherence constraints the law would need to obey if we didn't know the law already, or if it wasn't so easy to find a simple law that fits together like that.
That's basically correct, except that I didn't actually calculate any prior odds or multiply them. When you're dealing with weird hypotheses on the order of my new world is actually a conspiracy at a low level of sophistication distinguishable to me from reality, where your own mind is doing a lot of thrashing, it can make more sense for a non-keeper like myself to make up the likelihoods, calculate the combined likelihood, and then just sort of let my intuitive mind keep track of the intuitive update that it feels after I stare at those likelihoods a bit. If I was keeping formal track of the chance of conspiracy, it would probably swing all over the place, because of the degree to which I'm making all of the likelihoods up. The thing to notice is, if it starts to feel to me like there's a trend, after I keep on making up likelihoods. But yes, that's the law for combining the results from multiple experiments.
Corva doesn't think that she could do that stuff on the board unassisted right now, so she's feeling a little bitter about Asmodia, who is, after all, the only other person in the room qualified to teach classes about alien math concepts right now. Declaring it obvious, it doesn't actually look that complicated, so hopefully Corva will be able to confirm its obviousness and apply it to future things later on, when she's gotten a transcript of this class and her brain isn't dribbling out of her ears. Right now, she's busy panicking about all of the rapid-fire baseline words in this lecture that haven't been explained and don't seem to have direct Taldane equivalents, and also trying to figure out what exactly an experiment is. It seems like that might be kind of important to figure out, given that she's apparently not allowed to do any of them without publicly announcing it and giving her predictions in advance. She's not going to ask this because a bunch of other people seem to know it already, and if she's in the slower half of the class, they're going to kick her out and ensure that her soul is permanently worthless.
Some additional points when applying this law inside of science that might not be obvious. Let me actually whiteboard the 3 points, so I don't forget the later 2 while talking about the first one. #1. Published experimental reports. Usually don't assign priors or calculate posteriors. They just report all cheap details of the raw data, and maybe calculate some likelihoods from obvious hypotheses. #2. Separate experiments are usually supposed to avert conditional dependencies. Watch out for when that isn't true. #3. If every obvious hypothesis has unexpectedly low likelihood over all the combined data, it means the true theory wasn't in your starting set, often that different experiments had different hidden conditions. Point #1, a published experimental report wouldn't make up priors or calculate a posterior the way Asmodia did in her example. That would be a weird kind of thing to claim as the knowledge of civilization. Somebody looking at your report might have seen other evidence. They could be working on a secret governance project and know about evidence you can't access at all. They might be considering hypotheses you haven't thought of at all. Or just, if you don't have formal ways of assigning priors, they might have more life experience in guessing those. Making claims about what civilization should believe in the light of an experiment is a prediction market's job, not the job of one experimenter who publishes a report. If there's very standard or very obvious particular hypotheses to consider, you might make people's lives easier by pre-computing the likelihood of the data on each of those hypotheses. But one of the big cautions is to consider that other people might have hypotheses you don't, which means you should try to report more details of the data than you already know to be necessary. Taking the 246 example, suppose that people just hadn't thought of the possibility that there was temporal dependence in the results, that they hadn't broken out of the mindset where they were expecting the Keltham environment to be a timeless function that always produced identical output measurements for identical inputs. They did run across one duplicate input, but didn't notice it was a duplicate input when they recorded the no. Maybe because 2 different researchers were querying the environment separately. Now think of how inconvenienced you'd be if that data was reported with input ordering information missing. Somebody reading through later couldn't see which inputs had happened before each other because you'd implicitly believed that the Keltham environment was time invariant and the inputs were exchangeable in the ordering. And think of how helpful it would be if the person had instead happened to include timestamps on each input, even if they didn't know it was important, so you could notice the Keltham environment taking longer to answer on some inputs, even if they'd missed that themselves. If the experiment was on people, the full report includes pseudonyms you can use to contact any of the experimental subjects, just in case somebody comes along later and wants to test subjects to see if they've got a particular gene in their heredity, say. Obviously, newspapers can't report all the data of an experiment in the middle of the text. Even most people who read the published experimental report directly won't review all the raw data themselves. Summaries matter, so yeah, the report will say, briefly up front and in more detail at the end, here's the theoretical likelihoods of the data for the major hypotheses under consideration. The newspaper story will say that. Plus, here's how prediction markets on related observables shifted immediately after the results came out. But the real report, above all, is the data itself. What reality answered back to you when you asked it a question. Or, how did the watcher over children put this? Some more of this is coming back to me now. It's not the job of the experimentalist who writes the published experimental report to say what civilization believes, to tell everybody else what to believe. It's not the experimentalist's role in society to say what's true. That's the job of prediction markets to say. Only prediction market traders get to tell everybody what they should believe, because they're the ones who'll lose money if they're wrong, And if you think you know better, step up and bet yourself, because anybody can. So I'd guess there was a failure mode they were worried about, where experimentalists start to take on a social role of saying what's true and don't lose a lot of money when they're wrong. Or something like that, anyways. Though that failure mode itself sounds a bit ill-defined to me. What happens when two experimentalists point in different directions? But yeah, the whole science system is put together as carefully as governance. Unfortunately, I did not pay as much attention to exactly why everything had to be exactly that way, because I wasn't skeptical about the science system, the same way I was skeptical of governance as a kid.
Most people in most parts of the world probably don't have enough money that it would matter that much, even to them, if they lost it. Not that she's going to point this out.
Keltham's view of a world dominated by prediction market traders telling people what to believe is honestly adorable. Would he reconsider, after Asmodeus just was smarter than he is, and won all the bets, and took all his money? Which, after all, would just happen.
Did this start with a government doing it and then doing so well they conquered everywhere else? I don't see how you'd know it was the best way if there aren't other ways it beat out.
Would you accept the prediction markets say the results won't be as good if we don't use prediction markets as an answer?
No.
Me neither. One answer is that there's always cities inside civilization trying something different, because if there is anything Dathilan lacks, it is not people who think they might have better ideas. So far, none of the cities trying something other than prediction markets and traditional science have produced vast quantities of new knowledge and technology, enabling them to impress the rest of Dathilan into stunned agreement. If you mean historically, we don't know a lot of things about our own history that you might otherwise expect us to know, for reasons I'm not getting into at this point. I'm guessing that Dathilan had a different trajectory of intelligence, that something catastrophic happened in Galarian to drive the average intelligence level down to 10 after writing had been invented, at average intelligence 12, and spellcraft had been invented at average intelligence 14, or whenever the leading geniuses would be smart enough to do that. Or writing got carried over from a world that is cousin or common ancestor to Dath-Ilan, and then something happened to lower the average intelligence here. My point is, I'm guessing that, by the time prediction markets were around, people generally were smart enough and had enough law that they wouldn't go to war and conquest, that they'd do something else which was not that, and just, form civilization, because why not? I'm also guessing none of you are going to believe that, and there are obviously other options. Maybe prediction markets came along, and science came along, and there were factions that refused to adopt that didn't know law, didn't want to be taught law, didn't want their children to be taught law. And then the way of civilization, or what became civilization, if they thought anything like civilization thinks now, would be to say, you can refuse to learn the law yourself, and that's fine, but you cannot choose for your children that they'll have no chance to learn it. And everybody in your faction is going to have their head cryopreserved upon their death, because to refuse that is the one mistake that people cannot learn from in time, and you do not pass the competence test to credibly claim to civilization that you know all the reasons not to do that, and you are choosing to do it anyways. And the people in those factions would tell pre-civilization to go die in a fire, after which pre-civilization would say sorry, and come in with superior technology that shrugged off whatever they had in the way of primitive pre-scientific explosives, and teach their children, and save everyone's heads when they died, and plan to apologize about that 1,000 years later. I am not sure a world of Kelthams would do exactly that. I'm not sure we wouldn't either. Children are not their parents' stuff. Children don't have imaginary ownership tags pointing to their parents. I think in the Keltham verse we'd probably be less inclined to storm in and do things anyways, if it was about people telling us they didn't want their heads cryopreserved, because their heads, their souls, are their own stuff, and not ours. The children are not anybody's stuff. If the parents in that dissident faction were like not letting their kids own stuff, The kids there aren't allowed to buy books with law in them? I think the Kelthamians probably invade them over that. All the adults in the Kelthamverse used to be children themselves.
Some parts of those stories are plausible. Some parts are not at all plausible. There are a lot of things she'd like to object to in that, now that she's thinking about what things are true, but you never object to claims about history, and you super extra double don't object to claims about history, with the threat of the wall hanging over everyone. Even so, Corva makes a note to ask the project leadership whether they are permitted access to the known information about ancient Asland and about the more recent trajectory of standardized wizarding education over the course of the last 100 years, and maybe also about the origins of wizardry itself, if anyone remembers them, and how they relate to other kinds of arcane magic, if that seems like a safe thing to ask for, obviously.
Asmodea's tempted to just kidnap Corva Talandria off the project and put her to work on the wall, frankly.
This might be a slightly dangerous question, but why is average intelligence important for inventions? For societies, yes. He cannot imagine the average person in his village functioning in Dath Ilan. But how does it contribute to inventing writing, except as it produces inventors of genius? He has the idea. You could have a broader distribution with more failures and more geniuses, or a narrower with more nobodies, and what matters for this is the geniuses, not the average. He's just not sure how to express it.
You need both? There's a lot of work to be done in science. That doesn't need to be done by geniuses, but does take intelligence 18. That'd be one of my primary guesses for why Galarian is missing so many Dath Ilani ideas, despite having +6 headbands and artifact headbands. My other primary guess is that even the artifact headbands are only enhancing some of the key aspects of mentation that go into science. At some later point, we may experiment to see whether Fox's cunning, Owl's wisdom, and Eagle's splendor altogether actually help naive subjects on the 246 challenge at all. Though that would be only one of many tests.
Willa's been musing over something in her head, but then she gets a mental approval from Asmodea to just ask about it out loud. If your pre-civilization mostly paid attention to prediction markets when deciding what to do and what to believe, couldn't the factions around it just convince it not to attack them by buying into and distorting their markets, or to do lots of other things that might not be in its interest? It sounds like a huge vulnerability.
Do you know what we call it in civilization when somebody comes in and spends a lot of money to try to shift a prediction market away from the lawful value? In baseline, free money. Prediction markets don't generate money out of nothing. You can only make as much money off a prediction market by being right, as there is wrong money to bet against you, for you to take. A ton of wrong money coming into a prediction market is a subsidy that can pay smart people the cost of their time to come in, stare at that market, figure out what the correct price ought to be, and buy up shares trading significantly away from that price. From the perspectives of smart traders, it doesn't matter whether the person is foolishly trying to distort the market or just foolish. It's a subsidy to them either way. The more stupid money goes in to be taken, the more smart people crowd around competing to take it at exactly the right price. People who try to distort prediction markets just end up making them more accurate. You'd need to be able to literally outbid the rest of civilization combined to still be standing there buying shares at a bad price after everyone else in civilization who wanted free money had run out of money they could use to take your money. That's why civilization trusts prediction markets so much. They're a form of speech where lying costs you, and then if you try to lie anyways, no matter how much that costs you, it just makes the truth stronger. To be clear, there is a fundamental vulnerability of this sort, but you can't exploit it just by being rich. The hypothetical corrupted keepers could prevent civilization from doing anything they didn't want civilization to do, by bidding in the prediction markets, openly as the keepers, to say that dreadful bad results will happen if civilization does that. Relatively few people would want to bet against the keepers, not because it's illegal, to be clear, but because you'd probably lose all your money unless you're literally Nemamil. Then civilization doesn't do that thing, and the market on that policy never resolves, and the keepers don't lose any money for lying that way. This is a central problem in all of decision theory, that we never get to observe the results of the actions we don't take. We never get to see our expected utility estimates tested for everything we thought had less than optimal utility. There's a lot of places where civilization solves that problem by randomizing slightly, if doing slightly the wrong thing won't be catastrophic. But the really important predictions, you don't do that there. And that does open you up to assault by the hypothetical corrupted keepers or other actors inside civilization who can afford to put up a lot of money and come up with persuasive arguments and have enough of a reputation to make other traders nervous. But it requires acting openly to make the other traders nervous to bet against your reputation. There's a limit to how much you can corrupt civilization's decisions and markets that way, because if you do it a lot, people will be suspicious, and not just anyone can do it either. That said, yes, the keepers have bid against things in inscrutable ways now and then. It wouldn't be an especially helpful act to compile a public list of all the times they've done that, but they've done that even in markets I've been tracking. To this day, I have absolutely no idea why the keepers fear long-term consequences specified to the rest of us, only as people will later vote that was a bad idea. If civilization makes a harder push on teaching average kids more computer science, once my generation's kids are slightly smarter. I mean, it's very credible that computer science reshapes some people's thoughts in some internally damaging direction, which the keepers would rather not point out explicitly for obvious reasons. It doesn't obviously fit into any plan of corrupt world domination. But, yeah, what the keepers bid against largely doesn't get done, and if they were hypothetically corrupted, they could in fact be steering civilization that way.
Alexandra is now curious what computer science is. Anything the keepers don't want him to know has to be powerful.
Asmodia is now curious what computer science is, and if it's going to destroy all of Galarian unless somebody stops it, where somebody is probably going to be Asmodia, because the rest of Project Lawful is composed of suicidal disaster monkeys.
The mortal is thinking correctly again. It's unfortunate that this mortal already has an ownership tag pointing somewhere in hell, preventing her from clericing it. Ottomans has never really understood before what some gods seem to see in their clerics. Now, however, Ottoman sees. This mortal would not just be a useful tool. This mortal would be a useful tool requiring minimal ongoing maintenance.
Anyways, I'm going to move on to hash 2 now, in hopes of eventually traversing this conversational data structure. Point hash 2, since I was dealing with the same Asmodia over time, I had to consider the conditional dependencies in my evidence, and couldn't treat them as approximately independent. I had to ask, assuming that Asmodia was writing down a prediction that I was trolling her, having updated my model of Asmodia off that fact. What chance would she then have of putting a probability on that prediction? That's not my baseline probability for Asmodia putting probabilities on things. It's the Asmodia who was already predicting well enough to know I was trolling her, which is an Asmodia more tuned in on the rhythm that is Keltham than the Asmodia who didn't do that. Then I had to consider that question separately for each possible world of ordinary, conspiracy, time travel. The facts inside a single world can interact among themselves. The facts between worlds don't. Not in this example, anyways. Different possible worlds can start interacting if you get into multi-agent logical decision theory. Even in this example, conspiracy Asmodia would be trying to guess what Keltham would think ordinary Asmodia would do. But those complications shouldn't come up every day. And in most of science, we can ignore them. In science, usually, when the replicators set up a new experiment at a new location, the results there shouldn't be causally entangled to any significant degree with the results of the previous experiment. If you find yourself thinking that what you expect, given a particular hypothesis, on the new experiment is being influenced by what happened in the previous experiment, it means you're not narrowing down your hypotheses enough, which will hugely complicate any efforts to combine your data if you've got to consider how all your pieces of data are interacting with each other. If I was really making a serious run at updating on ordinary versus conspiracy, I'd need to consider multiple possible conspiracies, drawn finely enough that what I saw in one piece of evidence didn't much affect my likelihoods on other pieces of evidence. Actually, This would probably be a lot clearer with some math. So let's do that, considering the hypothetical case of us experimenting to see whether enhancing all 3 Galarian known mental stats by +4 would help previously unexposed subjects on the 246 challenge. Simplifying things down way too far for the purposes of keeping the math simple on its very first presentation, we'll say that the only variable we measure is whether or not somebody solves the challenge during their first 5 minutes. Now, how would you do science? To see whether +4 to all mental stats helped. I'm going to let researchers and candidates from any tier answer, because I expect this one to be pretty hard just starting out. But if I'm wrong about that, and Asmodia or Carissa are seeing it immediately, do call prediction rather than just tossing out the complete answer.
She still doesn't know what science is or what it means to do it to something, but there's an obvious thing to look at, isn't there? Well, test whether people who read 14 in every mental stat get it within 5 minutes more often than people who test 10 in each.
With what resources? Strategies will vary depending on what we can afford.
Not the scientific way of thinking about it exactly, but not at all bad either. You even simplified the math some. Though saying they got artifact headbanded is not what the original experimental spec was. We were specifying natural all 14s, which will probably give us noticeably different results. One does want to learn to think precisely about that sort of thing. To compute that number there, let's observe it'll be the square of 6 to the power of 3 times 4 to the power of 2, divided by 5 to the power of 5, or 216 times 16 divided by 3,125. 2,160 plus 1,296 is 2,160 minus 4 plus 1,300 equals 3,456 divided by 3,125. About 1.1, since 3,456 is around 3,125 plus 312. Squared is about 1.2. So the results you saw are 1.2 times more likely if the all 10s have 40% pass rates, and the all 14s have 60% pass rates, compared to everyone having 50% pass rates. Now, I realize this ought not to go in a published experimental report, but what do you happen to believe seeing that? What would you believe if you saw that in real life?
Let's say on the one hand, you guess a 50% chance of getting it if the headbands don't matter. Then this situation has a chance of 0.5 to the power of 10 of coming up, since each one was a coin spin anyway. But if you instead thought 60% with headbands and 40% without, then for the headbanded people it'd be 0.6 to the power of 3 times 0.4 to the power of 2, with the winners being 0.6s and the losers being 0.4s, and then for the non-headbanded people you'd have 0.6 to the power of 3 times 0.4 to the power of 2 too, for the opposite reasons. So that's a chance of 0.6 to the power of 6 times 0.4 to the power of 4. Then we can multiply everything by 10 to the power of 10 to make the math easier, and the idea of 60 over 40 and 40 over 60 increased in probability versus pure 50-50. By 6 to the power of 6 times 4 to the power of 4 divided by 5 to the power of 10.
Not the scientific way of thinking about it exactly, but not at all bad either. You even simplified the math some. Though saying they got artifact headbanded is not what the original experimental spec was. We were specifying natural all 14s, which will probably give us noticeably different results. One does want to learn to think precisely about that sort of thing. To compute that number there, let's observe it'll be the square of 6, circumflex 3, asterisk 4, circumflex 2, slash 5, circumflex 5, or 216 asterisk 16, slash 3,125. 2,160 plus 1,296 is 2,164 plus 1,300 equal sign 3,456 divided by 3,125. About 1.1, since 3,456 is around 3,125 plus 312. Squared is about 1.2. So the results you saw are 1.2 times more likely if the all 10s have 40% pass rates and the all 14s have 60% pass rates, compared to everyone having 50% pass rates. Now, I realize this ought not to go in a published experimental report, but what do you happen to believe, seeing that? What would you believe if you saw that in real life?
Oh, yeah. Sorry about the headbands. I was distracted by the cool math, careless. But if I saw it in real life, I wouldn't believe very much of anything. It was only 5 in each group, and 2 of them randomly going the other way could have made it all look backwards. But times 1.2 isn't a lot of a chance boost either, compared to really knowing stuff about how the world works. So the math seems to look about right. It wasn't too convincing, and the math isn't too convinced.
I would go from believing that natural all 14s are going to be at a disadvantage relative to natural all 10s, to believing that having stronger mental stats and having had the experiences that go with them at least isn't actively disadvantageous, and probably does help. So, gods, why did she say that that was a terrible idea? He's going to make her do math in baseline right now, and then everyone will know how stupid she is about this.
Keltham nods at Corva, then addresses Willa. Seems a bit sus that the hypothesis you're comparing to the random coin spin is one where the supposed natural frequency of 30-minute guessers at those 2 intelligence levels exactly matched the data. Suppose we tested 1,000 subjects instead of 10. 245 out of 500 subjects with all 10 stats guess within 30 minutes. 256 out of 500 subjects with all 14 stats guess within 30 minutes. Then clearly, to ask how we should react to this data according to your methodology, we should compute the likelihood ratio over the fair coin spin of the hypothesis that among all 10 245 500ths guess within 30 minutes, and among all 14 256 500ths guess 245 500ths, circumflex 245, asterisk 255 500ths, circumflex 255, asterisk 256 500ths, circumflex 256, asterisk 244 500ths, circumflex 244, 255 hundredths, circumflex 1000. This simplifies to, let's see, a likelihood ratio of about 1.276. Keltham will now pause dramatically.
If you wish to support this AI reading and others like it, please visit patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI. Any help is appreciated. And thank you to executive producer John Doe 7776059.